have a situation where we are no longer trying to hide, or at least the Republican Party writ large and those in power are no longer trying to hide their appeals to nationalism and racism and xenophobia and all those other appeals to our worst angels. And those appeals are working. And now you might say, okay, fine. So those appeals are working for, Trump's base. What is that, 20% of the voting public? Well, yeah, in theory. But that brings me to the next thing I want to talk about. Let's not panic. Part 2, voter suppression. So, again, we all know what voter suppression means, that a smaller and smaller electorate, regardless of who's registered, regardless of who wants to vote, regardless who is polled, a smaller and smaller electorate is actually able to cast votes that count, that are counted. And that smaller and smaller percentage of people whose votes are actually counted is white, Republican, non-immigrant. Now, this isn't hysteria. This isn't crazy liberal snowflake conspiracy theories. This is actually happening. And as with the dog whistle, not dog whistle politics, they're not really trying to hide it. So Google voter suppression. It's happening. In North Dakota, where Heidi Heitkamp, the Democrat, is locked in a very, very tight election for Senate against, she's the incumbent, and she's fighting for her life, in a state that went for Trump and that gave her the Senate seat because of the support she had among the North Dakota Native American tribes. Interestingly, the latest voting rules from that state include a provision that in order to vote, your ID must have an address other than a P.O. box. Generally, Native reservations do not have street addresses. Tribal IDs do not have street addresses. The IDs that Native Americans hold in North Dakota, the ones they've always used as IDs, do not contain street addresses. Their houses do not have street addresses. So this apparently neutral rule that everyone has to have a physical address, a street address, disproportionately, if not exclusively, impacts the state's two large Native American reservations, without which Heidi Heitkamp is almost certainly going to lose her Senate race. So that's North Dakota. Georgia, Brian Kemp and Stacey Abrams are locked in a dead heat of a race for governor. Brian Kemp, the Republican candidate for governor, is also, interestingly, the Secretary of State of Georgia. And under his watch, if not his encouragement, the Georgia election system has somehow, for some reason, managed either to lose or to throw away or to render ineligible tens of thousands of African American votes for a variety of reasons, one after the other. Tens of thousands of African American votes in the purple state of Georgia, in a race for governor between an African American woman and a white man. The white man who happens to be the Secretary of State in charge of elections in that state. Again, not making this up. In Kansas, the Republican, very, very red Republican Chris Kobach, who is the Secretary of State in charge of elections, is himself on the ballot for governor against State Senator Laura Kelly, Democrat. Now, every last vote is going to count in this election. It's a very close election, and so Laura Kelly, the Democrat, is dependent on the votes of every single person of color in the state of Georgia, including the very large percentage of Hispanics who live in Dodge City, the famous get out of Dodge City. In this case, Chris Kobach's office, Chris Kobach, remember, is the Secretary of State and running for governor. His office has made it increasingly difficult for the residents of Dodge City, again, primarily Hispanic, to vote. They have, in fact, the county clerk of Dodge, the county that Dodge City is in, has decided to remove the only polling place that was in Dodge City, to move it somewhere way, way, way out of Dodge, that it's very hard to get to. So in all likelihood, a very large percentage of Hispanic voters who live in Dodge City will not be able to vote, or will be able to vote only under extreme difficulty. And again, this is the Secretary of State imposing these rules that have the effect of suppressing the vote of people whose votes his opponent is counting on. And they're not trying to pretend otherwise. The Secretaries of State, Brian Kemp and Chris Kobach in Georgia and Kansas, are saying, yeah, this is what we're doing. This is what we're doing, and really there's nothing you can do about it. Last week, the same Debbie Cox, the county clerk in Kansas, sent an email to Brian Caskey, the state director of elections. So this is the county clerk in Kansas, where Dodge City is, sending an email to the state director of elections with a letter from the ACLU attached. The ACLU letter is asking County Clerk Debbie Cox to publicize a voter helpline. Cox sends this letter to the state elections director with the comment, LOL. LOL. Look what the ACLU wants us to do. Oh, those silly kids. They think this letter can stop us from suppressing all those votes. So it's happening. And what that means is, I mean, we know that regardless of whether these things are ultimately found to be legal or illegal, regardless of whether they are constitutional or not, the effect of voter suppression efforts is to confuse and threaten and undermine confidence in the electorate, particularly those at whom the voter suppression efforts are aimed. And so the result is the people of color, the immigrants, the elderly, the uneducated, the illiterate, the poor, don't go to the polls. And so who ends up voting? The very people to whom those appeals to our worst angels were made. Think about that. You have overt racism, xenophobia, sexism, leading campaigns with voter suppression happening at all levels across the country, resulting in an electorate comprised disproportionately of white men who are drawn to vote specifically because of the racist, xenophobic, sexist campaigning. Where does that leave us? What is this election about?